Hi, folks. It's time for my yearly re-record. I'm going to try to do this a little bit more often because my supporters deserve to be thanked, and I want to keep things more up to date going forward. First off, thank you for returning to the Whiskey Ring. If this is your first time here, or if you're a frequent listener, please take the moment to like and subscribe, rate and review wherever you found the podcast. If you have suggestions for how to make the podcast better, or guests or topics you'd like to hear, please reach out to me at david@whiskymyweddingring.com or via Facebook or Instagram. Second, I want to thank my vintage level sponsors, those at the highest level who keep this podcast going. Truly, without these supporters, I would have had to stop doing this a long time ago. Thank you specifically to Don, to John and Jim, Bill and Connor, Steve, Jake and Bill, Trevor, Michael and Jesse, Jared, Brendan and Larry, Logan, Patrick and Andrew, Dustin, Wade and Gavin, Daniel, and Justin. Thank you all for supporting, listening, telling your friends about this podcast. Cannot stress enough how much you all make this possible to go forward. If you haven't yet joined the Patreon, please consider doing so at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. You can support for as little as $5 a month, where you can have access to ad-free episodes, and will also have priority if a vintage spot becomes available. Those spots are strictly limited, so if a spot becomes available, you're going to want to be the first to know. Lastly, going forward, I am trying to be better about posting show notes for each episode on my website, whiskyinmyweddingring.com. These show notes will have links to websites and socials for my guests, and will also have additional information not in the interview, including reviews and tasting notes whenever possible or relevant. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to have you back as a listener next week. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whisky Ring podcast. Today we're going back over to England. It's been a particular focus of mine after talking to Richard Foster back at the end of 2025. And thanks to Richard, he introduced me to this gentleman here, Richard Locke, founder, brewer, distiller, cleaner, everything you can imagine at Retribution Distilling. So Rich, welcome on.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So Rich, you are in Somerset, England. And I'm going to throw it over to you to throw us the origin story for Retribution Distillery.
Yep, I'll try and keep it relatively short. About 16 years ago, I started home brewing, and I got fairly serious into home brewing. Ended up studying brewing and distilling on a distance learning course up at Heriot Watt in Edinburgh, and that's where I discovered distilling. Before you knew it, I had a small still in the garden shed, started to play around. And then before it got out of control, I thought, right, license is in place. Let's get everything sorted. So I set up a full working distillery at the shed at the bottom of the garden. Fortunately, I outgrew that shed in about 3 months. And then during all of this, I used to work offshore in the oil and gas industry. So that's where the money to start the distillery came from. And also the distillery name came from there as well. Retribution Distilling, to pay retribution for where the money came from. Sort of oil and gas, a bit like probably solicitors and a few other people out there in the world. It's not the greatest industry to give you a happy sort of feeling inside working in that industry. Around the same sort of time as well, my partner and I had a couple of kids, and it was decided that I wasn't going to go offshore for 220 days a year. So we took the decision to move the distillery out of the garden shed, move to a small farm just on the outskirts of Frome. That was in February 2020, just before COVID hit, which in hindsight, obviously, pandemic, very, very bad thing, but for setting up a distillery, it was quite good. Gave us lots of time to get all the equipment in place. We started making rum, which was the first aged spirit we made, but the end goal was always to make whiskey. And then has followed on from that, has been a 5-year journey to where we are now. Going from a small alembic style still to the 2 stills you can see behind, building capacity, laying down stocks, and concentrating on what will be the future of the distillery, which is whiskey. And I'd say 95% of what we do now is whiskey production. The remaining 5% is vodka, which we make from heads and tails from whiskey production. And that is kind of where we are now. And perfect timing, that pump has just stopped. So give me a second. I can actually hear now. So that's where we are now. We are a whiskey focused distillery, but we do things different to the vast majority of English whiskey distilleries. And I'm sure we're going to get into more of our production stuff as we move on to the next hour or so. So that's a brief
Absolutely.
background.
That's awesome. And it answered one of the questions I had, which was where the name Retribution came from. Um, with the, I'm just curious though, with the background in the oil and gas industry, were you familiar with the kind of the science of distillation at all, or were you not on that side of things?
No, not on that side. I was more in the exploration survey side. I used to work on ships, so I had a good and I've had a pretty varied career before that. So I could weld. I know my way around sort of control panels. I've got a fairly good understanding of basic engineering. But from a distillation point of view, absolutely no clue other than what I learned at Heriot Watt and then simply learning, playing and learning. But the one thing I would say is that home brewing gave me a really strong background in fermentation, knowing what yeasts are capable of, what grain can do, what different barleys can achieve. So that was quite a strong lead into the distillation side of it.
Gotcha. And I think it was Owen Martin, who was a recent guest who was talking about the program at Harry Watt, also did the distance learning, and they were saying that they went in kind of like you did with the idea that they were focused on home brewing or brewing in general, and then because I guess the second year, the second half of the coursework is distillation, they got introduced to that, and then that kind of took off as their career. Um, I guess in your experience with Harriet Watt and with the people you might have interacted with, both as students and as teachers, do you think that's something that happens to a lot of people? They go in for brewing and suddenly distilling is just there for them?
Very possible. I think if you're a home brewer, or if you start out home brewing, it when you turn a hobby into a job, it's no longer a hobby anymore. Whereas the distillation was another pathway to making alcohol and being able to keep home brewing as a hobby. I still homebrew in my garden shed now. I've got a 1-barrel kit. I brewed end of last week, so I'm very much still homebrew. The distillation side of it is just a complete bolt on, and almost it's just a passion that just grew and grew. Sort of, it's different enough to homebrewing that homebrewing is still a hobby, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah,
But as for other people, I think certainly I think the UK or England is very different, probably to America. Distillation's illegal here. You can't just do it in your garden shed. HMRC, the government, take a very dim view of it. So distillation is a lot more controlled. And to be honest, you need to have your eyes opened by doing a course to actually see what's beyond those doors, so to speak.
So it's funny timing with that because for 100 and I don't know even how long, long time, just home distillation was illegal here, and then just in the last maybe 2 months,
Right?
we had a court ruling that invalidated that. So we're still waiting for the first story of someone blowing themselves up um, by doing it wrong.
It
But I mean,
shouldn't.
we know with like moonshiner culture and all that, it's not like home distilling stopped by any means.
Yeah.
But there's now the potential for it to be legal to do it at home. So we'll see how long that lasts before it gets challenged.
Yeah, there was no history of that in this country. There was no prohibition. There was no reason to drive it underground as such. I think if you go back far enough, then you'll find people were distilling down the end of, well, wherever they were living. But in recent terms, yeah, distillation is just not a thing to do at home. I think that it is growing. There are more homebrew shops selling distillation equipment, and there's more information on the internet for it. But yeah, it's nothing compared to other countries, certainly in Europe. If you sort of go out to Eastern Europe, it's a completely different sort of thing going on out there.
Sure. And this is a reminder too that even within the UK, England traditionally has been seen as more of a brewing culture as opposed to a distilling culture, like in Scotland and Ireland.
Yeah, definitely. It's if you go just looking back into history, England was all about gin. If you look back far enough, malt spirit was made in England back in 1890 at the sort of the last few big distilleries there were, but all of that spirit was either exported to Scotland or Ireland. It went into blends. Everything else just went to make gin. So yeah, again, it's just there's just not the history there in the country doing it. It is brewing. So much more. Yeah, there's a lot more home brewing going on. Probably nothing compared to what has been going on in America, I would assume. But yeah, definitely more home brewing. So yeah,
So going back to the beginning of Retribution, launching in, well, the gin launched in February 2020. You said you moved to the new location, outgrew the shed, moved to the new location 3 months
yep.
after starting. Uh, with rum being the first distilled spirit that you made, was that more a decision on like that's something that even aged could be aged shorter and thus on the shelves faster to
Um,
drive revenue?
yeah. So general store. The first thing we released was a couple of gins. We then had a white rum. Further down the line, a spice rum. Um, we made some decisions early on just to get the name out there. Um, I think looking back, I would do it very differently if I had better funding. Um, but at the time, we needed to generate a small amount of revenue. We made rum first simply because we had the equipment for us to make rum. Back then, I didn't have a mash tun, so you can make rum just by blending molasses with hot water in a tank and nutrients and a yeast, and you're off. But soon after that, we got the mash tun. We only ever laid down 13 casks of rum, and we haven't made rum now for probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years. So it is now, yeah. Rum was more of a stepping stone, and there's also sort of economic reasons for not continuing rum as well. Rum's meant to have been the next big thing in the UK for the last 10 plus years after gin. Hasn't happened. Um, there's and when I sort of think about rum, if I make a 3 or 5 or 6 year old cask aged rum, I need to sell that for an amount of money which is comparable to a 12-year-old rum coming over from the Caribbean. Um, and there's not the consumer base out there, I don't think, to support rum from small distilleries like myself. Um, I certainly would never sell a bottle of rum to anywhere in Europe, America, China, Japan. Whereas I think at some point in the next couple of years, we could easily be selling whiskey to multiple international markets. Um, and there's just more consumer demand for whiskey, English whiskey in particular, simply because it's new, I think. And there is just a bigger market for it. So from a business perspective, it makes more sense. From my personal sort of perspective, the drink I like most is whiskey. Beer and whiskey, the two things I drink, they're the things I actually want to make, and the whiskey is made commercially.
With that, I guess with that said, I mean, you already said that as of now, 95% of what you do is whiskey. Um, would you consider doing rum again in the future, or it's just not, like you said, those other reasons just make it
I
really not
Yeah,
a point?
the other really big issue, probably the wrong word, but one of the problems with rum is molasses. We have to import molasses from America, India, Malaysia. When I first started making rum, I asked my rum supplier, a company called Ragus, if they could tell me where the actual molasses came from. They turned around to me and said, "Oh, we can email you our anti-slave policy." It listed 26 countries on there because molasses is a commodity product. Um, so we have to import it from the other side of the world. Whereas in Somerset, we're surrounded by fantastic barley growing regions. We've got the country's oldest floor maltster 10 miles away. Um, where it makes no sense logistically and environmentally and any other way to make rum, frankly. Um, Then there's also the fact that molasses costs more than malted barley because we were using a high grade molasses. When it comes to waste, we can get rid of our whiskey production waste to a local AD plant, aerobic digestion plant. I cannot get rid of molasses pot waste to there because it's got too high a bio-oxygen demand. Um, there's a lot of process issues there as well. Um, the downside is just like whiskey, I enjoy drinking rum, and I think we made a really good product. But there's just too many things stacking up against rum for us. And the obvious answer is to concentrate on what's grown locally and surrounding us. And that is a, a grain or malted barley based liquid, and whiskey it is. Hopefully
It
that's,
makes
you can
sense.
see the reasoning behind and the sense behind that.
Yeah, of course. It. I think for me, it comes down to I'm always curious when people revisit their kind of origins and uh, what put them on the shelves originally. But you're right, it doesn't make sense, especially like you said, if you were. I think it would also be a different conversation if you were in a place where you were also having to import some or all of your barley and you weren't surrounded by it and within reasonable distance to a place like Warminster Malts and have your own, you know, potential soon, hopefully having your own malting, so a lot of difference there. But anyway, so we'll put the rum to rest uh, for now. Um, so the within the 95% or so that's whiskey. There's an interview you did recently within the last year. From that, about 30% is peated, Somerset peat, single malt English whiskey, 30% unpeated single malt English whiskey, with the remainder being in a single pot still in various whiskey-based projects. Would
Yeah,
that still be
there's
somewhat accurate?
up to this point, yes. The first 5 years of the distillery has been very much a learning process. The one thing we didn't do is we didn't go to a still manufacturer and say, "Can we have stills?" We didn't go to a consultant from Scotland and go, "Make us a new make spirit." Instead, I just played around and learn on the job, as it were. Different malt varieties, different yeasts, different cut points, different fermentation profiles. So to get where we are, we're just over about 120 casks of aging new make spirit and whiskey laid down, and there's probably 100 within that 120. There's probably 100 casks that are different to every other cask. We haven't got we don't have stocks of a consistent product yet. Um, so it's been very much a play, see what works, see what doesn't, learn from that, and move forward. Um, it's but the crux of it is you have to learn from the learning, and I think that's where the distillery will be going in the future. Um, but saying that, there's always going to be experimentation because as much as I try, I don't think I can actually stop. So it's trying to, I guess it's trying to balance more. And yeah, from a percentage point of view, up to this point, peated Somerset peat. So we actually have access to, I think it's one of the last licensed extractors on the Somerset levels to get peat from them. Um, Once a year, I've gone down there with my trailer. I get half a scoop, which is about probably 1.5 to 2 tons of wet peat. Come back, dry it out. We use that in our on-site kiln. One thing we've done recently is we've got applewood from a local orchard, and we've been smoking still green malt. So we're not just wetting malted barley and smoking it and drying it out. We actually get green malt off the floors at Warminster once a week, and we actually peat or smoke that. So we have been doing trials with different woods with the end view of moving away from peat. And that's something I'm fairly confident in the not too distant future we should be able to do. There is a big issue with peat extraction. We don't have a 200-year history of digging peat out of the local peat bog and producing a product with it for 200 years. We only started extracting peat for whiskey production 2.5 years ago. Um, and I don't know whether people that listen to podcasts know much about the UK and peat, but at the end of 2030, so in 3.5 years' time, they're banning peat extraction for horticultural use, so growing plants. And then at that point, whiskey will become the biggest single user of peat in the United Kingdom. And I think there's going to be some pressure put on all the distilleries using peat to reduce that. The big companies are already trying to get ahead of it by having like peat wetland regeneration schemes. There's a lot of people doing a lot of research to try and move away from peat. Um, the unfortunate side from a whiskey production point of view is Somerset peat is really interesting. It's very different to Scottish stuff. However, there is an environmental impact with that, which we need to address as a distillery.
I was wondering about this too, because I remember hearing about the ban that's going into place, and from an environmental standpoint, definitely agree with it. I guess the dissonance for me has been that really, let's look at across the UK, because I don't know the England specific data on this, but whiskey is generally the kind of number 2 biggest user of peat, but it's usually been described as such a minuscule number 2, way back behind the horticultural use.
Yeah, it's I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's probably like 1% or fractions of a small percentage. But I think this comes back to, in Scotland, they have a historic use of it. Retribution Distillery, we are the only English distillery that has access to English peat. We don't have that history. And I'm certainly not going to start an argument or any sort of conversation with environmentalists or MPs that are trying to ban the extraction, because frankly, from an environmental standpoint, it should be banned. It's about the worst thing you can dig out the ground. So we're looking at ways around it to mitigate what we're doing. And it comes back as well to the name, paying retribution. We need to make sure that we're doing things correctly. We use 100% green energy. We're just about to swap over to biogas for the stills because we use direct fire stills. We're just trying to be as environmentally conscious and sustainable as we can be, bearing in mind we are a whiskey distillery. By the nature of what we do, we are an energy intensive production process. And like I said, it's making sure that we're doing the best we can and not just making something because we can. Hopefully that makes sense.
Absolutely. I can't argue against it by any means, and this isn't to this is really just talking through the hypotheticals on that. And I guess the last hypothetical I'll throw to you then is, because you are right now the only English distillery that has access to English peat, even more so than that local English peat to you. There will, of course, if you switch over to wood, to apple wood, or be it another type of wood, there will be a gap, therefore, in the English market, if you will, for an English peated whiskey. If, let's say, another distillery comes up either in Somerset or somewhere else in England that has ready access to peat through all the licensed processes, do you think either as a producer or a consumer, would you be okay with them taking the mantle of having the only English peated English whiskey?
If someone else sets up and they want access to the peat, it's not my business to stop them. Would I have a problem with it? Business wise, no. Environmentally, we're trying to do the best we can. That doesn't mean everyone else has to. And I think if your entire business is centered around putting your stick in the ground of being the first and being the only, I think you're always setting yourself up to lose because someone else will always follow on. Retribution Distilling isn't about being the only or the first, although it's nice to be. The distillery is about flavour, and you can get flavour from many different areas. So if someone else wants to, good luck to them. Bearing in mind that I think there's only 2 extraction licenses still active in England, and I believe they both expire in 2040, and then they will not be renewed. So there is a very limited time period, and uh, I don't think anyone there are distilleries now that are looking at alternate ways to get smoke flavour into whiskey. They're smoking casks. They're doing all sorts of stuff. Um, but if someone else wants to, they can. If they can actually find the person and get it off them, good luck. It took me a while, and yeah, they're welcome to it. I'm not the Retribution Distillery isn't about being the first. It's about flavour, and that's what I'm interested in producing.
So I promise the rest will not be about Peat, but I have one or two more questions related to it.
Yeah.
So as of now, I think, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong on this, when you were interviewed by Paul Abbott over at Grasmere, and he's going to be a future guest as well.
Yeah.
When Paul interviewed you within the past year, you were about 18 months or so away from releasing your peated whiskey. And I think I saw on the website you were aiming for like March of 27.
Yeah, so basically, March. To be completely honest with you, it's the first cask we laid down. Peated new making a tawny port cask. It tasted fantastic from 12 to 18 months. So I've just literally been counting down the days till it hits the legal three-year point. So once it's turned 3, it'll be coming out of that cask and bottled. So yeah, March is roughly when it's going to be, and it will be the first truly traceable bog to bottle English peated whiskey. And it's a nice thing. And hopefully it will go down well with people who tried it. I can't remember if you got a sample of that.
I think I did. I was admittedly you can't see because of the background. We just got back from vacation, so my sample area is a mess right now. But I am pretty sure because I got that Rich, for listeners, Rich was very generous to share, I believe, a sample of that, several of the yeast trials as well, which we'll talk about later, which were they're fun for me because I'm a nerd and I love that stuff. No, but I do believe I tried either without having it in front of me, it was either the Tony cask or a PX cask. It was definitely a red spirit. So
if it looked red to pink, it was the tawny port cask, because it looked like rosé at one point. It was bonkers.
Yeah, that sounds right. And I remember tasting it. I remember it being really excellent on the palate. It was not for the age of it. It had a really good balance between the port influence and the peat and the whiskey. The spirit was not lost underneath, which can happen really easily with port, PX, sherries. So from that side, again, from the consumer side, I'm really excited to have people try it as well. With your kind of support base and the market that you have right now, and understanding that the peated run will be a limited run for however many barrels you have of it.
Oh, there's one cask. At the moment, that release will be one cask, 360 bottles ish.
Right. So, yeah, 360 bottles worth. So, 120 cases, maybe, no, 60 cases. 60 cases, I guess.
Yeah,
6 bottle cases. Yeah. So, not a lot. And then, like, however many other casks you might have of peated spirit, there's a limit. So, do you think or anticipate that there will be a run on your spirit, especially if people know that like you're not making any more of it?
Yeah, possibly. It's the one thing I would say is the trials we've done where we've used other woods, the apple wood in particular has. I don't have a tasting panel, but I have a group of people that I send samples to for feedback, And when it comes on the new make spirit side of it, everyone has preferred the applewood smoked over the peated. And just to say how good the peated was, the first ever lot of peated new make we made got a gold medal at the IWSC. I think it scored 95 points. And everyone's been saying that the applewood version is more rounded, has a better flavour to it. There's more aromatics going on in it. But yeah, there are people that are going to look at a wood smoked whiskey as almost a second class whiskey in comparison to peated. But I think it's like anything. If you can actually get them to taste it, it would be a different story. And there's enough other distilleries in Europe now, certainly up in the Scandinavian countries, that have been smoking grain for ages, and even down as far as Thompson Distillery over in New Zealand, that I think it is getting a foothold. So will there be a run on it? Possibly. I'm not, when it comes to pricing, personally, I'm not greedy. We'll price it roughly in with our pricing, the way we price things. Beyond that, I have no idea what other people will do with it. Hopefully they'll drink it. That's what I'd like them to do with it, because I don't see any point in just putting it on the shelf and looking at it. But yeah, is a limited spirit whiskey, peated whiskey, a good thing? Yeah, it could be. Are we missing a trick? Probably, because we should be making a lot more of it, but environmentally and sustainability is not what I'm looking to do. And I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it goes down. People might not even like it, so it might not be a problem, but hopefully that won't be the case.
Hopefully not. And it's funny you mention a couple in Scandinavia. So we've had Kyoto on the podcast, Thompson recently in the last 6 months or so from New Zealand. And Thompson is an interesting case because Matt's been doing both peat and Manuka wood smoke. So he's got the side by side on that. And
Yep.
I'm curious to throw this to you as a flavor exploration. I've found that wood smoke, and this includes some in the U.S. that I've tried too, of either cedar or mesquite smoked, popular in South and Southwest, where it's definitely different from peat. I don't think people would confuse the two, but somehow the wood smoke can be a little more volatile, like it can be a little stronger, if you will, and overtake the spirit a little more. And that's just to my tastes, not for everybody. I'm curious, as someone who is transitioning from peat to wood smoke, are you trying to achieve a similar flavor profile, completely new one, or something that maybe someone tries the peat could go over to the wood smoke?
I think one of the big differences, and I don't know how other distilleries are doing it, but if you smoke fully malted barley, so quite a classic way of doing it is you get your malted barley, you spray it with a hose, and then you smoke it. You get a very superficial aroma off of it and a flavour, and quite a shallow flavour. If you smoke green malt, so basically malt that's been steeped for 3 days with air brakes, laid out on a floor for 3 to 4 days, and if you're actually smoking green malt, you get a very different flavour profile. And I don't think that many people are actually smoking or peating with green malt. When they say they're peating, I think they're using fully malted barley, or the majority are. And I think, yes, if you go for the fully malted barley and then you smoke it, I think, yeah, you get a very shallow flavor, but lots of aroma coming off of it. Whereas if you actually go down the green malt route, you get a lot more depth of flavor and almost less volatile notes coming off it. And am I looking for a completely different flavor profile? Not really. I don't, when I produce a spirit, it is what it is. I don't try and massively shape it into one thing or another. Pretty much everything I've done has just been happy accidents that it's worked. But it goes back to a simple philosophy of good in, good out, rubbish in, rubbish out. So from a flavour perspective, applewood will simply be what it will be. I think it is similar to peat, but but you're right from the point of view there's more going on the nose of the spirit. Um, but when we don't do 100%, or up to this point we've never done 100% peated or smoked malt. We always blend the peated with standard Maris Otter or Plumage Archer or whatever grain we're using. So I try and strike balance when it goes into the cask as opposed to blending it down after the event. So I think that might have a big impact as well. Um, I look to create something drinkable from when the spirit comes off the still. I don't just try and create a very peat forward or smoked forward liquid and then go, well, we'll deal with that in 5 years' time when we blend it out with a couple of casks of something else. Um, so I think when you have a spirit going into cask at the peat level you want it to come out the cask at, that has an impact as well. So yeah, the real answer to that is when I started the smoke from wood, I had no idea what I would get. But what's come out is good. And it's a shame that I didn't send you a sample because you could have tried them side by side. But I think there are notes of like there's notes of peat in the applewood, but then there's differences as well. I haven't tried to create a flavor profile. It just is what it is, and luckily it happens to be pretty good. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It could have gone the other way. You could have tried the Applewood and said, "Wow, this is terrible. I don't want to do this," and have to find a different way to
Well,
uh,
the
to vote.
reason I kind of had an idea that it would work is I've used applewood on a barbecue at home quite a bit, and it is a very popular wood to use when cooking various different meats. So, and yeah, I would say I like applewood cheese as well, but there's absolutely no applewood smoke in that. It's all chemicals these days. Um, Although I'm fairly sure I might be able to find an artisan cheese producer in Somerset that is actually smoking their cheese, but anything from a supermarket is dosed with chemical, unfortunately.
Definitely, and same thing goes for like an Applewood smoked bacon. Not much of it is,
No,
unless you're getting it from the farm or from a butcher. Not much of it is actually smoked with
yeah,
Applewood.
yeah, no,
Uh,
definitely.
yeah, but kind of to the point that I'll move on to the next topic is that's kind of a level or smoked cheese. That's the level that I almost look for in a whiskey in a way. Like I want it to enhance the flavor of the core product as opposed to overwhelming it and be like, this is a wood smoke whiskey, and then everything else underneath you kind of have to search
Everything,
for.
everything I've ever done peated and now applewood smoked wise is I want to create a whiskey I can sit there of and drink half a bottle of. I don't want to sit there, have 1 or 2 drams, wake up the next morning with an ashtray in my mouth. I don't want that. I want to, and from a business perspective as well, I actually want people to drink more of the product so they buy another one as opposed to have one every year for the next 20 odd years. Because I've got some whiskey on the shelf at home that's so heavily peated that you have one of them and actually you're done. Whereas I want to sit there and enjoy it. So that a lot of drinkability is a big part of it. Which again, I try and make the new make spirit to be drinkable, so the end product is. But there's a lot of moving parts in the middle, admittedly.
That is a core tenet, I think, of people who come from the brewing side. Is almost to a person that I've spoken to about this, be it you, Holyrood, talking to Brendan from Cologne in a week or two. Anyone who comes from the brewing side is always saying, make sure you're putting good stuff in the still and good stuff in the cask. That's where the flavor is going to come from.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. If you are a yield driven distillery and you want to hit your 420 LPA liters per alcohol a ton, and then you're going to stick it in heavily charred or sherried or whatever casks, then you can rely on the cask to do everything. Whereas I want every step of the process to add flavour. So we use heritage and land raised barley varieties, Plumage Archer, Maris Otter, hopefully fairly soon Chevalier as well. We have pretty much stopped using any distilling yeast now. So all of the fermentations we do are with 100% brewing yeast strains. When it comes, it's all minimum 7-day ferment, for a couple of reasons. It works, and also it works around family life as well. I mash one week, distill the next week. It just rolls on nicely on a calendar. We control the fermentation profile, which is something a lot of distilleries don't do. So their new make spirit will change winter to summer. We can have the same temperature profile in 30-degree heat in the summer or -2 in winter. Direct fire copper pot stills. You can see them sat behind me. Basically, I designed the things, had them made in Swindon, flame on the bottom, Maillard reaction caramelization. It's creating flavor at every step. We're not just relying on the cast at the end of the process. And I think there's a lot of smaller distilleries that are all doing the same thing, and they're producing some amazing liquid. And it's not a coincidence. It's fairly obvious why. They're not chasing yield.
Yeah, for sure. And
Yeah.
no, I was going to say that's, I think, a great segue into the fermentation question. So I want to just mention, I mentioned this to Rich before going on air. If you go to Retribution's website, you can look at a study that was done in 2024 with Open University, where you sent in two cast samples of New Make Spirit, one of Maris Otter, one of Plumage Archer, to have it GCMS'd and see where the compounds were. And it's a fascinating study. If you don't want to read the kind of the really detailed study of it, you can look at the slides and get just as much out of it, I promise. But it's really interesting is that's I was saying to Richard, that's something that I really wanted to do with a bunch of spirits that I've had, that either because they claim to be one thing and I'm like, I don't know about this, or just to see, could you, I think I originally thought of it in the context of rye, because rye is a big thing in the US here right now, where we're trying different ancient grains of rye or landrace varieties that went out of fashion because the yield wasn't as good, or because people just weren't making rye or growing rye in the first place. So it's definitely worth taking a look at, and I'll link to it in the show notes for sure. You already mentioned you got the 7-day fermentations, temperature controlled, and I'm curious to hear, because you had started with some of the distiller's yeast at the beginning, ideally just for yield, I would think, just to kind of get things moving.
Yeah, we've always blended. The only time I've ever done 100% distilling yeast is when I've done a small amount of contract distilling for someone else, and that's what they've specified. But from cask 1 all the way through, we've always blended a small amount of brewer's yeast in with distiller's yeast. And yeah, originally the theory is if you pitch 500 grams of brewing yeast and a kilo of distilling yeast, you'll get 90% of the flavor-ish, perhaps maybe a bit less from the brewing yeast, but then the distilling yeast gets you over the line. And you will get about a 6 to 7% possible increase in yield off the back of that. And you will get most of the flavor. But what we have found is that if you drop out the distilling yeast and you just go with brewing yeast, you get more flavor, and I think just a more interesting flavor. And it's just one of those things. The new make spirit that we produce using an old English yeast, people have tried it pretty much all over the world now, and everyone always comes back with the same thing. That's the best new make spirit. That's one of the best things we've tried, so on and so forth. So I've kind of avoided it for as long as possible, but we are actually making more of that now. It's kind of daft not to. I think it really is one of the best things we made, and it's a combination of all of those things I spoke to you about: yeast, barley variety, and direct fire, and 7 days. I think the big thing as well is, and it gets overlooked a lot, floor malted barley. I think with me, from what I understand now, that's just a non-negotiable. If you want flavor, it has to be floor malted.
Yeah.
If you ever go to Warminster, and you look at the floors are alive in there. There's bacteria, there's lacto all over the floors. I know we're getting into the summer, and they've actually just had to clean all the floors to keep them under control because, like I said, they're alive, and that is
Understandable.
flavour, and that just adds to it. So yeah, it's just a combination of all of that.
I well, and you are. I think I alluded to this earlier, but you are aiming to have your own floor malting. I think
Yeah,
by the end of this year, right?
I will run a few small batches through. The issue with malting and having run and tried to kiln grain for the past 2.5 odd years, um, you can steep grain in anything. That's easy to do. You just need a bit of floor to lay the grain out on. It's getting a reasonable amount of grain kilned before it goes mouldy, which is the hard bit. So the kiln we've got on site, I put about 140 kilos in it, has a moisture content of about 45%. 2.5 days later, the moisture will be about 8 or 9%, and I'll be left with just under 100 kilos ish, or yeah. And if bear in mind our standard mash is half a ton, so 500 kilos. At the moment, I only run the kiln once. It takes me 5 weeks. It would take me 5 weeks to have enough grain to do one single mash. So yeah, we will do it, but it will be on a very small scale and it will be a side project until we can get uh, a bigger kiln in. Don't get me wrong, I've got a plan in my head for a half a ton malt kiln, and it wouldn't be expensive to make. But the other issue as well, it's the labour of malting. Um, the sheer number of hours it takes to look after that grain and keep it where it needs to be. I'd have to employ one person full time, probably just to make a ton of malt a week, if I was lucky. Um, so I think, yeah, we will play around malting on site, but it will be like a once a year project. Or we'll malt on site for probably 2 months to do to do two mashes, and that's just the way it is. So it's more of that will be a passion project more than anything else. Um, so yeah, it's just something I want to do for fun. But yeah, it's not going to be easy, and it'll be very time consuming when I should be doing sales, frankly, because I don't do enough of that as it is.
Fair enough. At the end of the day, got to bring in the money. That's how things keep moving along. Um,
Yeah,
but I,
yeah,
yeah, but I know I hear what you're saying too, and it's I guess from an economic perspective too. If you're either close enough to or have a good enough relationship with Warminster that you can, get the malt that you want with the I was gonna say the tool, yeah, I guess the tools or the specifications that you want, then
yeah.
then
And
I
there's a couple of recent conversations. One of them is I've been talking to Liam, the manager at Warminster, about doing a customized kilning profile. So basically, a modern maltster, depending on how big they are, they'll load in the germinated barley. They basically ramp the temperature up over a period of Warminster or over about 19 to 20 odd hours, and then they finish at a certain temperature. And I asked the question, well, I've read some history books, and in the olden days they didn't get above 65 degrees. So could you do me a 3-day kilning run with no more than 60 odd degrees? That would be an interesting project. The flip side is to do that, I'd need to commit to buying a batch. So their standard is 10 ton, roughly 10 ton of barley in, gets you about 7 and a bit ton out the other end. So I just need to commit to that at some point. And it's just, yeah, there's no way I could do any of that. And yeah, it just makes complete sense to have some projects, which we do, but then 95% of all the barley we use comes from Warminster because frankly we're daft not to. It's some of the best, probably is the best malt in the country. Um, I'm fairly sure of that.
yep. There are very few people I've spoken to in the area, in the country even, who don't use Warminster for that exact reason. They've got the reputation and they back it up. So why not?
There's there's even some smaller whiskey distilleries up in Scotland that are just starting up, that they're sending their malt from Scotland all the way down to Warminster to get it malted to go back up. And yeah, it's the quality of what they're doing is fantastic. And again, it's the flavour of what they're doing and the way they're doing it. It's just, yeah, it's bonkers.
So this just came to me because you were speaking of the temperature that they would be malted at, or kilned at rather. With the stills, you were talking about the importance of the direct fire, the Maillard reactions, and for I can promise when we talk to Brendan at Cologne, he's going to go into that for sure because that's a big thing for him too. Um, with the it seems you're at two different parts in the process. You want two different things. So in the still, you want that high temperature, direct fire. You get the caramelization of the sugars and all of that. In the kilning process, by not going above 60 degrees, this is 60 Celsius, just to be clear. I think 60 Fahrenheit would take a really long time to dry out. By not going above 60 Celsius, you're really keeping it at a very low. Is that even getting toasted at that point, or is it really just drying out and getting the sugars available?
So, I think from what I've read and understand, colour is almost in the reverse of what you think it might be in a kiln. You might think you get a lot of colour at the end at higher temperatures. Certainly, if you're doing a Munich malt or something like that, but you can get quite a lot of colour as well early on by having warmer temperatures early on. One of the interesting things, this is more, there's no, I don't have any evidence to back any of this up, but Plumage Archer, when you look at the spec sheet, is very, very light in colour. I think it's like 1.9 EBC. So really, really pale. Whereas if you look at Maris Otter, that's normally closer to 3.5, 4. So just in a, and I don't know what the difference is in the kiln, in the profiles in the kiln, but I'd imagine they'll be relatively similar because they're both pale ale. Um, but you get a lot more colour in Maris Otter, and Maris Otter is known for almost a biscuitiness, a very sort of, yeah, like the classic sort of fruity, biscuity note to it. You don't get that in the actual Plumage Archer side of it because it's much paler. Um, and I prefer the Plumage Archer over the Maris Otter. Is part of that because there's less colour in it. And are you, from a distilling perspective, are you after the flavour of the grain, not the flavour of the kilning process? Does that make sense? I don't know. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
then there's, yeah, we won't, probably better off steering clear of thiols and things like that. But then there's also an argument from, depending on what yeast you use in, um, whether it's a thiolized yeast or whether it's even a lot of the more hazy IPA yeasts, I mean, brewing terms, they basically they can basically release the thiol compounds, which people always thought were in hops. Turns out there's more thiol compounds in barley than there is hops. So if you're using the right yeast and you've got a really pale malt, does that mean that less of those thiol compounds are being destroyed in the early part in the kilning? So is there flavour coming from there? And how does that all tie in? So I think, yeah, and I always kind of just go back to, there's so many people have said it. When was the best whiskey ever made? It's certainly not. If you sort of historically people talk about whiskey, they always go back to like a 1930s Bowmore or something. And not that I've ever tried a 1930s anything. That's way beyond my financial ability. Um, but it comes back to looking at how did they make whiskey back then, and it was lower kilning temperatures, it was brewing yeast, it was heritage barley varieties, it was direct fire. um, I don't know the ins and outs scientifically of it, but I think lots of those things have an impact. Whether they're measurable or not, I don't know. um, but yeah, it's, I think from a distilling point of view, too much flavor from the kilning process is probably not the best thing for the new make. But then we've
And
made new make spirit with 10% brown malt in it, loads of crystal malt, all sorts in it. And it all adds flavour. So yeah.
have you, with the yeast experiments that you've been doing, especially now that you're moving away from using distiller's yeast at all, have you found that particular strains work better with the Maris Otter or with the plumage?
We've used a couple of English strains with 100% plumage archer, and we've used a couple of English strains again with 100% Maris Otter. There is, yeah, the one that always sort of shines through. It's from manufacturer. I get all my yeast pretty much from WHC Lab, um, and they've got a yeast called Saturated, which I believe is London Ale 3. Some people refer to it as the old Boddington strain. Um, and it's one of those yeasts that's been extremely popular in craft brewing, for hazy IPAs and big sort of hop forward East Coast IPAs. So that's the one that I tend to use a lot of. Um, the flip side of that is from the yeast project we did, which was the 4 different brewers yeast. The one that really sung out for me was Fuller's. Um, the flavour from the Fuller's yeast in the new make was just absolutely bonkers. And from a yield perspective, it was great because Fuller's yeast acted like a distilling yeast. It fermented way below 1, and had fantastic flavour, which then kind of makes you wonder at some point, was Fuller's yeast a precursor of one of the distilling yeasts, perhaps? Who knows? Um, but that yeast is an absolute animal when it comes to distilling, or fermenting for distilling. The crux of it is there's so many yeasts out there that trying to pick one's not easy. So we tend to talk about brewing yeast as a general term. I try not to talk about specific strains of yeast as such. But yeah, and just avoiding now. It's avoiding distilling yeast because it's yield over flavor every day with them.
I forget whether it was in the study or in a kind of companion article that is on your website's blog from January of this year, I want to say, speaking about the yeast and how most of the distillers yeast used today, the M1, the Pinnacle, Lallemand, what have you, they're pretty similar in a lot of ways, and they probably do have that
Genetically,
common ancestor.
yeah,
Yeah.
genetically, you'll probably find them identical. Um,
Yeah.
it, I don't want to speak about how yeast companies work, but if someone is selling the classic distilling strain, it is M1. If someone is selling something that's a more industrial version of M1, then it is MG plus. Then so it's just, I think what is interesting though is, the smaller, um, compared to the Lalamons of the world, the smaller yeast companies, and WHC being a big example, is they're doing a lot more research, looking into getting their hands on different strains and making them available for craft distillers. Which when I started, the only distilling yeast available to me were M1, MG plus, and a few wine strains that you could play with. Now there's multiple distilling strains. So I think there's even, whether it's going on, but possibly down the line, there'll be hybridization of yeast as well, trying to combine different brewing yeast with distilling yeast to give you the best of both worlds. But from my point of view, though, it's just brewing yeast. I wish I had a big brewery next door that I could get yeast from every week. My yeast company wouldn't like it, mind, because I wouldn't buy yeast from them as much. But um, it's the one that I always keep coming back to is this yeast called Saturated, which is London Ale 3. It's just, I find it works really well in the process. Chances are, if another distillery used it, they'd probably think it wasn't that great. But it's just a culmination of all the things we do differently along the process means it works really well.
So moving to sorry, last thing on fermentation was the you were looking at one point in bringing in some wooden fermentation tanks.
Still on my wish list. I would love to get my hand on some vats or fooders, whatever you want to call them. The whole idea of the wood is inoculated with yeast and bacteria, and it's just flavor again. I don't. It, basically being a new start whiskey distillery, the thing that limits us more than anything, frankly, is just money. Um, and to buy wooden vats, fooders, is going to cost quite a bit of money. And at the moment, that's money we need to put into buying malt and yeast to lay down. If I can find some cheap, relatively cheap, free. I like free is my favourite price. Um, then I would love to get my hands on them. In the meantime, what we can do is we don't actually clean out our fermenters that well. We just rinse them with a jet wash. So we look for like a biofilm to build up on the inside of the fermenters. There's no reason why we couldn't hang a lump of wood in the middle of the fermenter if we wanted to. Um, So yeah, there's a few options that way. Um, but yeah, I would love wooden vats. They're not in the next year or two unless I can find a pile of cash or wooden fermenters.
Or, I mean, you never hope for another business to go out of business, but if a brewery goes out and they're like, well, we got some stuff hanging around, you know,
There's one about 5 mile away from here, but I'm not sure I'll ever get my mitts on those. Um, yeah, no, it's just randomly. Wild Beer Co. They're they're just not they're old brews just up the road, and there's 3,000 litre fooders in there and a 7,500 litre wooden vat in there. Um, the only problem is you need a low loader and a high ab to move them things. Uh, in the distillery I've got, the biggest door I've got is 2 meters by 1.5. So I couldn't even get them in here anyway. They'd have to come into bits to come in. Uh, yeah, there's lots of, I would love it, but there's lots of reasons why I won't have them anytime soon, unless I can find them for next to no money, which I doubt.
So I want to spend just a couple minutes on the stills, of course. So you mentioned a few things already. They're your
Yeah.
design.
Yeah.
I think if I heard it right, they were inspired by the Montagna rum.
No, the very first still I had, which I actually sold. The first copper pot still I had, that was a 400 litre alembic. Um, and that was when I first started out. Montagna Distillery were really interesting. They were using fireboxes under the stills from a safety perspective, which was really good. Going back, I actually got the design for the fireboxes that Montagna Distillery used. I think they still probably use them on the small stills, and I actually built one and then used that. But since then, no, that still's been sold off now. It's gone to another distillery. The ones basically behind me, they were simply, I design the things. People say, how do you design a still? It's fairly simple. How big's your door? Um, and when you look at the cost of copper, copper sheets come in 2 meters by 1 meter. What's the most cost efficient way of making a pot with a column on top? And that's how they were designed. If you want to take it further, you could easily just take any picture of a distillery in the world, as long as someone stood next to it, take it into AutoCAD, and you can scale off of that, and you can copy the design of any still you want. But these were designed and fabricated out of necessity, door size, copper size. The big one that side, 1,800 litres, that's Mark 1. And then the second one there was Mark 2. Mark 2 general design's a lot better, the way the flue gases go around the actual pot. But yeah, it was just design it, make it. And funnily enough, if you design a still yourself, if you get a fabricator to make it, it's probably about 15% of the cost of going to one of the big manufacturers and getting them to make it. And it kind of goes back to when we started the distillery. Whenever I say we, I do mean I. When I started the distillery, we started it on about £20,000, and we've just grown out of cash flow organically. There has more recently been a small amount of investment that we've got a few local people and people I've been introduced to, but everything has been built because of a complete lack of cash. But that inherently has given us the liquid we've got. And if we'd have started with millions, I don't think we'd be making anything as good as we are. It's basically been built through necessity, and I think that's had a massive impact on the liquid and created something very unique. Because I can tell you the recipe, I can tell you the ins and outs of everything we do, but those stills are so different to anything else anyone's using that it's all fairly pointless. Um, but yeah, made by Elite Stainless Fabrication in Swindon. I jokingly said to the guy that owns the company, Mark, "Oh, can you weld copper?" He went, "Yeah, I started out welding copper in the pharmaceutical industry. But if I give you a drawing, can you give me a price?" And that was how it all started. So yeah, made the 1800 litre still first, then the 1200 litre. As I said, they're both direct fired, and yeah, it's just sort of grown out of an idea. And then yeah,
I'll ask my kind of nerdy question that I'm probably the only one who really cares about, but I am interested in this. Is there are very few direct fire stills anywhere. Spoke about that with Sukhinder Singh recently, a couple weeks ago, because he's all about the direct fire. He's like you. He wants the direct fire, the floor malting. Um, so in I know in Ireland there's one, maybe two direct fire. One of them being Cullowen. In Scotland there's maybe half a dozen doing direct fire. In England, again, maybe a couple. You probably know better than I do. How many, but not very many, because it's difficult. It's not. It's harder to get the safety inspection on there. Um, so you said you used the firebox for the first still. How difficult was it to get kind of the safety regs in place and all of that for your new setup?
Basically, the way it kind of works in the UK, we've got DSEER, dangerous substances, explosive atmospheres. It's about separation. Anything is achievable as long as you have separation between the ignition source and what's coming off the still. So you look at the regulations, you build the stills to enable you to do that. You just look at failure points on gaskets, manways. You make sure that the flame is actually contained. Because in some ways, this sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but you're better off with a constant source of flame in a distillery or a constant source of ignition than you are with one that sparks on and off every 12 hours. So you don't want a build-up of any sort of flammable gases. Ventilation's key. And like I said, it's just we have a minimum distance between, obviously the manways on the top of the still is directly above the fire underneath. However, the fire's in a box. The manways have all got multiple latches. There's no single point failure. You're then, it's kind of pointless. No, it's not point. We don't have any method of closing the vapor path. So we physically cannot get a build up in pressure inside the stills. But then you have blow off valves, which are all vented externally. And then you make sure that where your liquid's coming from is the required distance away from the flame. You make sure that everything's in stainless, regular maintenance. Everything is doable and achievable as long as you look at it, risk assess it, and put mitigating steps in place. Are we perfect? Probably not. But I think the big thing that we do that's very different is that our stills are mechanically bolted and they're sealed. And this is one of the reasons I got rid of the alembic still I had, is the only thing that holds an alembic still together is a bit of flour paste or some silicon tape. So if you get a build up of any sort of gas inside that, the thing literally pops in half,
Right.
which is not a safe way to do things. So you certainly continental Europe, there is a lot more direct fire stills. Pretty much all of the Cognac region in France, as far as I'm aware, they're all using direct flame. I think the French government tried to make them swap over to steam. The spirit went to rubbish, so they just went straight back to direct flame again. Hindsight, I think we've got direct fire on both the spirit and the wash still. Hindsight, you don't need direct flame on a spirit still. There's nothing, you're boiling a clear liquid. The flavor's locked in at that point. I would love to, at some point in the future, probably swap the spirit still over to electric elements, ATEX rated elements, stick a solar panel on the roof and a big battery bank in, so we can basically take that still off grid. I would possibly at some point in the future might be interesting to swap over to wood for fueling the wash still, simply so we're completely disassociated with oil and gas and what goes on in the world. It would be great to buy all the fuel from a local estate, burn it, and go around that route. But that's slightly off track. Everything is possible if you try hard enough and you are committed to it. If you do something half-heartedly, then yeah, you're doomed to fail probably.
With the stills, so you've been using, how long have you been using the current setup?
We've had the big 1,800 litre wash still behind me for just over 3 years. And then the 1,000 litre spirit still on that side we've had for maybe 14 or 15 months. And what's really been quite interesting is the alembic still we had before, which used to be our spirit still, that had a worm cooler on it. Because you'll also hear a lot of people talk about the difference between basically a worm cooler versus shell and tube heat exchangers. Say something a little bit different to what most of the industry thinks. I can't taste the difference. We've swapped over from basically a worm cooler to shell and tube. I can't taste the difference in the spirit, mainly because the spirit we make is so heavy and oily anyway that you can't detect any real difference. But then again, my palate's not that good.
I mean, I won't comment on that because I can't say, like, my palate's not perfect by any means. But at minimum, I mean, you know your own spirit, so you're gonna know if there's a little bit off or something. You're gonna know it faster
Yeah,
than anybody else.
yeah. No, I think a lot of this it comes back down to the raw ingredient side of it. Heritage, landrace barley, brewer's yeast, direct fire. I think it gets to the point where you're loading so much flavour on the front end that difference in coolers doesn't have a discernible. No, it will have an impact, but I don't believe it has a discernible impact, or certainly I can't taste it. Someone else might say something different.
Someone else always does. So, uh, so I know we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. I want to be conscious of your time. Um, I want to ask about, of course, about your maturation. So what the barrel aging looks like.
Yeah, varied. It's up to this point very, very varied. We age some stuff in small casks, so octaves. We've got quite a few octaves, quarter casks. Majority of what we've got is 200 litre beer ex bourbons or various sherry and port casks. I've up to this point, I just tend to try and get the best casks I can, the freshest casks I can, and that has driven where we've gone to an extent. So at the moment, we get sherry casks from Spain, Rodriguez cooperage. If we want port casks or some other interesting casks, J. Dias. Bourbons at the moment, I've just ordered a load from Speyside Cooperage. We normally get ex Heaven Hill casks from there, and they normally come straight out of the containers. They're as fresh as a small distillery can get. Price point's brilliant on them at the moment as well. I think, yeah, they've literally a third of what we were paying 18 months ago. So I've bought a year's worth of bourbons. So all sorts and everything, whatever I can get that is interesting and good quality from a reliable, trusted source, basically. There's going to be a bit more structure to it moving forward. We do need to get, especially we're going to be making a lot more of one type of new make spirit. So we're just looking to actually get a small amount of that liquid laid down. well, for us, it'll be a big amount, but for everyone else, it'll be a small amount. Because, yeah, typically we look to lay down about 40 casks a year, probably. And then, yeah, just we've got more and more stock now turning 3 years old. I think our first year of whiskey production, we laid down 4 quarter casks. Our second year of whiskey production, we laid down 2 hogsheads. And in the third year, we laid down about 37 casks of different sizes. So we went from nothing to, for a small distillery, a reasonable amount. And we're just trying to carry on at 35 to 40 casks a year. Obviously, cash flow dependent. But yeah, it's varied. I think the bizarrest thing in there at the moment is we've got some aged new make in a orange bitters cask, which is very odd, but interestingly odd. There's there's all sorts in there basically.
Actually, orange bitters. I'd be
Yep.
interested to see what that ends up as. We've had a couple of Curacao casks come out recently in the last 5-10 years, and they've usually been pretty overwhelming, I'll be honest. But I'm curious what the orange bitters is, because that's just a different flavor profile.
Yeah, I pre-made old fashioned maybe. But to be honest, I think it's that thing. You just need to realize, get it out of the cask before it goes too far. And then we can always try and bring it back the other way if needs be. But it was just a random. I got a load of fresh orange bitters casks. Oh, go on, why not? It's only, the thing is, it's only it's only a couple of 100 liters. But yeah, so there's, like I said, we get a lot of second fill octaves as well. We get them from Atom Brands, who do a lot of sort of cask finishing in small casks. So they use small sherry casks for some of their Darkness series stuff. We then buy those after they've used them for 3 or 4 months. We've had some fantastic results with those in the space of 3 years. We've created some really good stuff. There's also chestnut. We've got some chestnut casks, which that'll actually be released in September this year. And people say, oh, what does chestnut taste like? Frankly, it tastes like chestnuts, but with a peppery spiciness to it. And that currently, we had liquid in them for 13 months, which I think was too much. We took it out and put it into second fill ex-bourbon, and it's actually mellowed it out, and it's actually really, really interesting now. But then we refilled those chestnut casks for a second time, hopefully get 2 years in second time. Then we might refill them again and try and go for full maturation in the chestnut for hopefully 3+ years. So yeah, I bounce a lot of casks around, backwards and forwards. I try and get multiple uses out of every cask. And in the future, we'll be filling more second fill sherry stuff, more reused stuff, to try and get some bigger age statements as we move down the line. Because to start out with, the new make spirits, it's been suited to aging for 3 to 5 years. We are now, when I'm running the stills, I make a conscious decision to basically have a bit more heads or a bit more tails for basically looking at longer term aging. And I think we're going to have more of an eye on creating the new make for 12+ years and then putting that into the right type of cask. There's no point making a really super clean new make spirit and putting it in a bourbon cask and then expecting to sit on it for 25 years. That's going to be cooked in 8 to 12. I think there's a few distilleries in the UK that, or certainly in England, that they talk about 25-year aging and all sorts, but they're making a really clean new make and putting it into a first fill bourbon. It's just like, yeah, it's just
going to get lost.
Yeah, it's picking the right cask, the right new make spirit with now an eye on, I wouldn't say long-term aging, but certainly medium 12 to 15-year sort of aging period. And we also need to play around now a lot with out of all the experiments we've done, nothing has been truly bad, but there's some stuff in there that even I look at and scratch my head over. 100% Munich malt. It's like, I really like it, but it's Marmite. You either love it or hate it. And we just need to look at some of this stuff now, and some of it we can turn into interesting projects. I've got small bottles of new make of some of the really odd, crazy stuff, so we can sell new make alongside the end whiskey. And so you can, and that's some really interesting points, but it needs to be approachable and good as well as a bit wacky. We just need to make sure that we do the right thing with it now moving forward. Otherwise, we'll end up with a lot of projects that are just odd, which there is a market for. But it's not big.
True, very true. Speaking to that, I guess my second to last question is: what has beyond the awards that you've received, in particular, let's say, as the fully aged whiskey has come out? So after 2025, when you had the 3-year age statement, and it can be called whiskey, what has the reception looked like from the consumer, and what do you think is the strongest market?
It's been really interesting. So I think certainly there's obviously there's two types of consumer, and there's people in the middle, but there's either a group of people that get it and understand what young English whiskey is, and then there's the group that all they care about is age statement and colour. You're not going to please everyone all the time. However, when you give someone a 3-year-old whiskey, you don't particularly tell them it's 3-year-old at a whiskey festival. They taste it, and you kind of say to them, "Well, how old do you think that is?" And someone says 6 or 9 years or something, and you tell them it's 3, they're just absolutely gobsmacked. I think that more people are understanding more now because more distilleries are doing it. But what's really interesting is that younger group of people that are getting into whiskey for flavour over age statement. They're really getting it. And it's trying to then work on some of the more rigid people in the industry and just trying to get them to taste the liquid, because once they taste it, they then understand that it doesn't need to be 12 years old. And I'm fairly sure some of the liquid smaller, younger distilleries are making in England at the moment that's 3, 4, 5 years old, substantially better than a whole load of stuff coming out of Scotland at 12 plus years. It comes back to this idea of good liquid into cask means you get good stuff out in a short period of time. So consumer groups, it's the younger, open-minded, motivated whiskey drinker. I think in the not too distant future, certainly need to start thinking about how to get some of our liquid outside of England or outside the UK. Looking to try and start working with more people in Europe. And yeah, looking to the future, it's just to be honest, anywhere that they're drinking whiskey, I think there is a market for us to go there. Don't get me wrong, we have to get the liquid there. It needs to be economically viable. Yeah, English whiskey at the moment is having a bit of a moment because it is new, it is different, it's vibrant. And in quite a lot of ways, and we're not Scotch. We're not, which sets us apart. Good job. We actually managed to avoid that topic until this point. I'll stop before I carry on. Right.
No, I know you have very strong feelings on it, but I also know that the interviews you've done have spoken to that already. So I wanted to try to, we can weave it in, of course, but
Yeah.
I was like, he's asked that question before. So I guess the last question I'll throw to you for today is, you said earlier at one point, you need to spend more time on sales, and brought it up again recently with, needing to just get liquid to lips and explore the markets. For someone who, looking at your career, I'm curious of your perspective. Has anything in your career so far, across multiple industries and hobbies and such, do you feel like anything has prepared you for the sales pitches you need to make? And if not, how are you finding that role?
When you know something inside out, back to front, upside down, and you truly believe in what you're doing and you're passionate about it, I can speak for hours about what I'm doing. I guess standing in front and teaching people or educating. I used to be a scuba diver instructor many years ago, rebreather diving, trimix instructor, and all sorts of stuff. So that's kind of prepared me for standing in front and talking to people. Having a more senior position working offshore, being responsible and having to do training to a degree helps. But I think it comes back to when you're passionate about something, when you actually care about what you're doing, standing there and talking to people is easy. The kind of, and the bit that does help is that when I actually do go and do sales, people are actually speaking to the distiller. They're actually speaking to the person they want to be speaking to. Don't get me wrong, you can get some fantastic salespeople that really know what they're talking about, but sometimes when you go to place, people actually want to, and when people then understand, or you're in a shop and you're selling stuff and they actually realize that you are the distiller, then I think that goes a long way to helping. Have I don't have a sales background at all. Frankly, I don't have a business background either. That's more been the interesting point, is trying to actually run a business that actually doesn't make a profit for years and years. So no, the ability to speak to people I can do, get information across I've done before. But yeah, sales wise, no, just having a sales strategy. That's just, trying to come up with one. So yes and no, but mainly no is probably the answer.
The self-awareness is most of the battle, so I appreciate that answer. And so with that, Rich, thank you so much for coming on, chatting about Retribution. I'm really excited about what I got to taste. I'm hopeful that we can get a couple of bottles, whether it be from whatever casks come down the line, over here to the US, so we can get people trying it here as well. I know it might not be economically viable right now, but maybe after the King's visit, it'll be a little bit better. um, so with that in mind, hang on with me for just a minute after recording, just close out a few things. And I want to say thank you again to Richard Foster for the introduction. I'm really glad we got to chat. And if you're listening, like, rate, and subscribe wherever you can. Let's keep the 5-star review going on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll see y'all next week.
Thank you.